Since the dawn of human history, men have set out to explore what lay beyond the far horizon. Some have dreamt of conquest, such as Alexander the Great, who conquered lands from Egypt to India long before Christ was born. Others hope to establish new colonies, like Eric the Red, who founded a settlement in southern Greenland more than 1,000 years ago. Still others went in search of adventure, like Marco Polo, who traveled overland to China in the 13th century, opening the way for trade in silks and spices. But one of history's most famous explorers, while eager to discover gold and other riches, was also inspired by a deeper, more spiritual goal. This man was born in the bustling seaport of Genoa, Italy in 1451, just as the Renaissance was spreading across Europe. As a boy, he worked for his father, who was a master weaver. He also began making short voyages to ports along the coast, perhaps to collect supplies of wool. While mingling with the sailors on the docks, no doubt this young man pondered his future and the prophecy contained within his very name. For his name was Christopher, just like the saint who legend tells us carried the Christ child across a raging river. Christopher knew that his name meant Christ-bearer, and he believed that he too was destined to carry the gospel of Jesus across a body of water, perhaps to lands as yet unknown. By his early 30s, Columbus was well on his way to fulfilling his destiny. He was working with his brother as a map maker in Lisbon, Portugal, and he was making occasional trading voyages, often in the Atlantic, known then as the Ocean Sea. By this time, Columbus had been sailing for almost 20 years, starting as a lowly ship's boy and working his way up to captain. An excellent navigator, he had sailed as far north as Iceland, as far south as the equator, as far east as the Aegean, and as far west as the Azores. He had taught himself to read and write, and had even learned Latin. Columbus spent long hours studying the scriptures, as well as books on geography and the heavens. Like most educated men of his time, Columbus knew the world was round. In fact, he often made notes in the margins of his books about an idea that fired his imagination, the possibility that one could reach the lands of the East by sailing west across the ocean sea.
Aristotle says that between the end of Spain and the beginning of India lies a narrow sea that can be sailed in a few days.
As a devout Catholic, Columbus often prayed for guidance, and he became convinced that God wanted him to make such a voyage. But he needed the support of a monarch for this enterprise of the Indies, as he called it. First, Columbus approached the King of Portugal, but he turned the project down after his advisors warned that Columbus had underestimated the distance across the ocean to the Indies. Next, Columbus decided to appeal to the Catholic sovereigns, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, whose marriage in 1469 had united the two most important kingdoms of Spain. Fortunately, on the way, he stopped at the Franciscan friary of La Rábida. There he met Father Juan Perez, once Queen Isabella's confessor, and Father Antonio de Marchena, a learned geographer, mathematician, and astronomer. They listened with enthusiasm as Columbus revealed his plan. Then the two friars helped arrange an audience with the king and queen. Isabella was fascinated by the potential for new dominions and expanded commerce. She was also intrigued by the thought that there might be many souls across the ocean sea who could be converted to the Catholic faith. However, at this time she was preoccupied with the fight to regain Granada, the last stronghold of the Moors, the Muslim peoples of northern Africa who had occupied Spain for 700 years. Still, Isabella asked a commission of scholars to review Columbus's proposal. Columbus waited 4 long years for their decision, only to learn that he had been rejected. He was deeply disappointed by the news and decided to leave Spain for good. But Father Perez again intervened and persuaded Isabella to reconsider the proposal. Then on January the 2nd, 1492, the Spaniards captured Granada and banished the Moors forever. After more than a decade of searching for support, Columbus finally saw events turning in his favor. Isabella's advisors still objected to the voyage, but the king's finance minister assured her he could arrange the financing. At last, Isabella agreed to support the expedition, even offering to pawn her jewels if necessary to raise the required funds. On April 17, 1492, Isabella and Ferdinand accepted Columbus's terms, and by May, preparations were underway in the town of Palos on the Rio Tinto. By royal decree, the town was ordered to supply the Niña and the Pinta, their crews, and enough provisions to last a year. Columbus chartered his own flagship and renamed her Santa Maria in honor of the Virgin Mary. 90 men signed on to sail with Columbus into the unknown, among them sailors, stewards, carpenters, silversmiths, and surgeons. By early morning on Friday, August 3rd, all was ready. Columbus and every member of the crew attended Mass and received the sacraments before boarding the ships. Father Perez blessed the fleet. The sails were unfurled.
Forward in the name of God! Forward in the name of God!
And the greatest voyage of discovery in the history of mankind was underway. The fleet sailed to the Canary Islands, where the ships stocked up on food, water, and firewood, while repairs were made to the Pinta's rudder. Early on September 6th, Columbus heard Mass at this Church of the Assumption, which is still standing. Then the fleet set sail due west along the 28th parallel. Columbus kept a detailed journal throughout the voyage. He reported that the winds were steady, the sea calm, and the weather glorious. Religion played an important role in life aboard ship. Columbus himself prayed several times a day.
Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name.
Thy kingdom come, thy will be done.
At daybreak on each ship, a boy recited the Lord's Prayer and the Hail Mary. Throughout the day, the crew prayed and sang hymns, including an ancient hymn to the Blessed Virgin at sunset. Every half hour, the youngest hand on the watch sang out as he turned over the glass.
5 is past and 6 floweth. More shall flow if God willeth. Count and pass, make voyage fast.
As on most voyages in those days, conditions aboard ship were difficult. The food was limited to staples like salt meat, dried fish, nuts, and dried peas. The water often went bad, and there were few bunks. Most of the crew slept in their clothes wherever they could find a spot. As the days wore on, the men eagerly searched the horizon for a sign of land. By October 10th, the ships had been sailing for longer than any previous voyage on the ocean sea. They had not seen land since leaving the Canary Islands 31 days before. Most crew members were ready to mutiny. They wanted to give up and go back. Columbus promised that if no land was sighted in the next 3 days, he would indeed turn back to Spain. But signs of land were everywhere. They saw great flocks of birds flying overhead. They fished a carved piece of wood from the sea. They watched flowering tree branches float by. Land must be near. Suddenly, on the night of October 11th, Columbus thought he saw a light in the distance, like a small wax candle that rose and fell. But soon it disappeared. The ships raced onward in the moonlight, making rapid headway through the heavy seas. Then, at 2 hours after midnight, a sailor aboard the Pinta had sighted a small island, land at last. At daylight, the three ships sailed into a shallow bay and dropped anchor. A crowd of curious natives gathered to watch as strange-looking men came ashore in small boats. Columbus carried the royal standard of Castile, while the captains of the Nina and Pinta each displayed a banner of the expedition, with its bold green cross on a field of white. They all knelt, kissed the ground, and gave thanks to God for having reached land safely. Then Columbus arose, named the island San Salvador, which means Holy Savior, and claimed it for the King and Queen of Spain. Columbus did not realize he had discovered a whole new continent. He thought he had reached an outer island of Japan, which is named Cipangu on this globe made in 1492. He believed if he continued sailing west, he would come to the mainland of China, where he would see the Grand Khan and all the treasures of the Orient described by Marco Polo. For the next 3 months, the fleet explored islands throughout this sun-drenched sea. Columbus named several of the islands in honor of saints and had his crews set up great wooden crosses in many locations. Everywhere, friendly natives greeted the explorers, who offered them knitted caps, glass beads, small bells, and other trinkets. Columbus noted how the natives slept in hammocks, smoked something they called tobacco, and traveled among the islands in enormous hollowed-out tree trunks, canoes that could hold up to 50 people. Columbus believed these gentle and trusting natives would easily accept the Catholic faith, as he noted in his journal on November 12th.
They believe and know that there is a God in heaven. At any prayer that we say, they repeat and make the sign of the cross.
On Christmas Eve, the fleet was sailing off the coast of modern-day Haiti when disaster struck. Late that night, the Santa Maria ran aground on a coral reef. In spite of help from the natives, the ship could not be saved. Columbus ordered that timbers from the wreck be used to build a fort, which he named La Navidad, or Nativity, in honor of Christ's birth. 39 men volunteered to stay behind at La Navidad, while Columbus, several natives, and the rest of the crew returned to Spain. On January 16, 1493, the Nina and the Pinta turned eastward and began the long voyage home. A series of terrifying storms struck the ships in the mid-Atlantic, and another storm forced Columbus towards Portugal, where he landed on March 4th. From Lisbon, he sent a letter to Ferdinand and Isabella describing what he had discovered.
For this, all Christendom ought to feel joyful and make great celebrations and give solemn thanks to the Holy Trinity.
Ferdinand and Isabella gave Columbus a hero's welcome, and all of Barcelona turned out to celebrate. 6 natives who had returned with the expedition were baptized. Columbus was granted his own coat of arms and full honors as Admiral of the Ocean Sea and Viceroy of all the islands he had discovered. Who was this great navigator, this explorer whom we honor on October 12th each year? The Genoese mariner was indeed a Christ-bearer, a man of faith who held firmly to his deepest beliefs and forever changed the course of history.